The gunshot reverberated through the canyon, like a final judgment. However, Silas Ward had not intended to strike what he actually hit. He remained motionless, his weapon still emitting smoke from his shaking grip, gazing at the tiny form collapsed near the large stone. The child appeared no older than 12, dressed in garments foreign to any local homestead. An Apache youth. What brought this Native American child so distant from his tribal homeland? Why did he travel alone, moving stealthily among the rocks at daybreak? For 3 hours, Silas had been following what he believed was an injured buck. The trail of blood brought him to this collection of crimson boulders where dawn's vapor still hung like spectral appendages. He had spotted movement, lifted his firearm, and discharged at what ought to have been his quarry. Rather, he had wounded a child. The youth lay still, dark liquid gathered beneath his slight body, contrasting starkly with the light earth. Yet something else existed that defied logic. Rope bound the boy's hands, and his wrists bore marks appearing days old. Someone had kept this child prisoner. But who? And what reason brought him to this desolate location, restrained and fleeing? Silas knelt near the unmoving figure, his thoughts spinning with unanswerable questions. The boy's respiration was weak yet consistent, alive, though barely. Then he detected them. Horse hooves approaching rapidly from the eastern direction. Several riders moving with intent, heading directly toward the spot. The boy's eyelids briefly opened, locking with Silas's stare in absolute terror. His mouth formed a single word in fractured English. Hide. Then his eyes rolled upward, and he became limp. The hoofbeats grew nearer. Silas could now hear voices, coarse and furious voices shouting words beyond his comprehension, but their meaning was unmistakable. They were pursuing this boy. Whatever circumstances led this Apache child to this isolated valley, bleeding and bound, remained unfinished. And now Silas was involved, regardless of his desire. But his next decision would astonish everyone, particularly the boy's tribe when they sought answers. The choice came to Silas in that instant before the horsemen appeared over the hill. He couldn't allow them to discover the boy in this condition, injured and helpless. Without hesitation, Silas lifted Dakota into his embrace, amazed by the child's lightness. The boy's head drooped against his shoulder, blood seeping through his ripped garment where the bullet had wounded his side. The injury wasn't mortal, but required immediate care. The voices intensified, harsh and insistent. Through the morning haze, Silas glimpsed 3 mounted men, their faces weathered and merciless. These weren't Apache. Their attire and equipment identified them as wanderers, the type who earned their living through illegal means. Where did that little vermin disappear? One yelled, his voice echoing across the stones. He cannot have traveled far with those restraints. Silas pressed against the boulder, holding his breath. The boy in his arms shifted weakly, releasing a quiet groan that seemed thunderous in the morning quiet. One horse snorted, its rider stopping abruptly. "Did you hear something?" "Continue searching. The boss won't be pleased if we return unsuccessful again." The riders dispersed, their mounts' hooves tapping against stone as they hunted. Silas realized his concealment wouldn't last much longer. The boy required medical attention, and these men clearly intended harm. That's when he made the decision that would transform everything. Rather than remaining hidden, Silas rose, still carrying Takakota, and walked straight toward his own mount tied beside the stream. He moved purposefully, as though he belonged there, as if carrying an unconscious Apache boy was perfectly natural. "Hey!" one of the riders shouted. "You there?" Silas turned calmly, adjusting the weight in his arms. "Good morning," he replied, his voice steady despite his racing pulse. The 3 men approached, their leader bearing a scar down his left cheek. "Have you seen a boy pass this way?" "An Apache child about this height." He indicated chest level with his hand. "Cannot say I have," Silas responded, meeting the man's gaze directly. "I've been hunting since sunrise. The only thing I've encountered is this." He gestured toward Takakota, as if the boy was naturally his responsibility. The scarred man's eyes narrowed, examining the unconscious child. "That's him," he said slowly. "That's our property." "Your property?" Silas questioned, his hold tightening protectively around Takakota. "He belongs to us. Another rider declared, reaching for his weapon. Hand him over. But Silas was already retreating toward his horse, his mind racing. These men had held Takakota captive. This was evident from their words and the rope marks on the boy's wrists. Whatever their intentions, they weren't benevolent. "I think not," Silas said quietly. The scarred man's hand moved to his weapon. "Son, you don't want to complicate this unnecessarily." What happened next would trigger events beyond anyone's prediction. Silas knew he faced superior numbers and firepower. 3 hardened men against a young rancher with 1 accurate shot and an injured boy in his arms. But sometimes desperation transforms cowards into heroes. "This boy has been shot," Silas announced, his voice carrying across the morning air. "He needs medical care, not whatever you men intended for him." The scarred leader laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "Our plans aren't your business, boy. That little Apache is valuable to certain buyers. Money." The word struck Silas like a physical blow. They weren't merely holding Takakota prisoner. They were selling him. The rope marks, the terror in the boy's eyes, the desperate escape attempt. It all made horrible sense now. "Over my dead body," Silas said quietly. "That can be arranged," the second rider said, cocking his rifle. But Silas possessed an unexpected advantage. He knew this terrain better than his own reflection. Every stone and gully was carved into his memory, from years of hunting and herding livestock. The creek behind him led to a narrow gorge that would force them into single file. "You gentlemen might want to reconsider," Silas said, still backing slowly toward the water. "This is Ward property you're on. My family has resided here 20 years. Neighbors notice when strangers visit. It was a bluff, but it succeeded." The scarred man's confidence wavered slightly. The Ward name carried influence in these parts, and reputation was everything in the territories. "Doesn't matter whose land this is," the leader said, but his voice had lost some certainty. "Business is business." Takakota stirred in Silas's arms, his eyes fluttering open. The boy looked up at his unlikely savior with confusion, then noticed the 3 riders. Fear flooded his young face, and he attempted to speak, but only a whisper emerged. "It's all right," Silas murmured to him. "You're safe now." But they weren't safe, not yet. The riders were spreading out, attempting to surround him. Within moments, they have him trapped with no escape. That's when Silas heard it. The sound he'd been hoping for. Hoofbeats from the east, approaching fast. Multiple riders. And these he recognized. Silas. The voice belonged to his neighbor Marcus Holloway. And he wasn't alone. 3 riders topped the ridge, weapons ready, drawn by voices carrying across the valley. The odds had just shifted. The scarred man cursed quietly, realizing his advantage had vanished. "This isn't finished," he snarled at Silas. "That boy belongs to us." "Not anymore, he doesn't," Marcus called out, his rifle trained on the strangers. The 3 men exchanged glances, weighing their options. 3 against 3 now, but they were on unfamiliar ground with armed neighbors who clearly knew each other well. "We'll return for what's ours," the leader said, wheeling his horse around. As the strangers departed, Silas felt Dakota's small hand grip his shirt. The boy was trying to communicate something, his lips forming barely audible words. But what the child was attempting to warn him about would prove more dangerous than any armed man. Back at the Ward ranch, Silas's mother, Martha, took one look at the wounded boy in her son's arms and asked no questions. She simply pointed to the kitchen table and began gathering supplies. "Hot water, clean cloth, and whiskey," she ordered, her hands already examining Takakota's wound. "The bullet just grazed him, but it needs cleaning." Marcus Holloway and his men had followed them back, still wary of the strangers who might return. "Silas," Marcus said quietly, pulling him aside, "do you understand what you've done here? Taking an Apache boy." "I know exactly what I've done," Silas replied, watching his mother work, "and I'd repeat it." But as Martha cleaned Takakota's wound, she discovered something that changed everything. Hidden beneath the boy's torn shirt, pressed against the skin, was a small leather pouch. Inside were 3 gold coins and a folded paper. Silas carefully unfolded the document, his face paling as he read. It was a bill of sale written in English, describing Takakota as property sold to a man named Garrett Wells for $50. They weren't just holding him, Silas said, his voice tight with anger. They purchased him. Someone sold this boy like livestock. Martha's hand stilled. She'd witnessed enough cruelty in her 45 years, but this was different. This was a child no older than her nephew back east. Takakota's eyes opened, focusing on the faces around him. When he saw the paper in Silas's hands, he tried to sit up, panic flooding his features. "No, go back," he whispered in broken English. "Please, no go back." "You're not going anywhere," Silas said firmly. "You're safe here." But Takakota shook his head frantically. "Not safe. They come. Many men come for Takakota." "How many men?" Marcus asked, his hand instinctively moving to his rifle. The boy held up both hands twice, then 3 fingers. 23 men. The number hit the room like a cold wind. 23, Martha breathed. Sweet mercy. What kind of operation were they running? Takakota struggled to explain, his limited English mixed with Apache words they couldn't understand. But gradually, through gestures and simple phrases, a horrifying picture emerged. There was a camp hidden in the canyons 2 days' ride north. Children were kept there, Apache and Mexican, taken from their families and sold to buyers from distant territories. "How long were you there?" Silas asked gently. Takakota held up 7 fingers, then made the gesture for moon phases. 7 months. 7 months this 12-year-old boy had been held captive, waiting to be sold to the highest bidder. Marcus stood up abruptly. "We need to get word to the territorial marshal. This is bigger than any of us can handle." But Dakota grabbed Silas's arm with surprising strength. "No lawman," he said urgently. "Lawmen help bad men. Lawmen take money, too." The corruption ran deeper than they'd imagined. If the boy was right, then go to the authorities might be signing his death warrant. "Then what do we do?" Martha asked. Silas looked down at Takakota, seeing not just a wounded child, but a survivor who'd endured months of hell. The boy had trusted him enough to speak, to reveal the truth about his captors. "We take him home," Silas said quietly. "Home?" Marcus asked. "To his people, to his family." But what Silas didn't know was that taking Takakota home would require him to do something no white man had ever attempted in these parts. The Apache territory began 20 miles north of the Ward Ranch, marked not by fences, but by an understanding that had kept the peace for 3 years. White settlers stayed south, Apache stayed north, and the few meetings between the groups were handled through careful negotiation. Silas had never crossed that invisible line. No Ward ever had. But as he prepared for the journey, loading supplies onto his horse while Takakota rested, he knew he had no choice. The boy needed to get home, and after 7 months of captivity, he deserved to see his family again. "You're making a mistake," Marcus warned. "Apache don't distinguish between good white men and bad ones. They see your face. They'll assume you're part of whatever happened to that boy." Martha emerged from the house, carrying a bundle of food and medical supplies. "The boy's fever broke this morning," she reported. "He's weak, but stable enough to travel." Takakota appeared in the doorway, moving slowly but under his own power. Martha had found him some of her late husband's old clothes, cut down to fit his small frame. He looked like any frontier boy now, except for the weariness in his dark eyes that spoke of experiences no child should have. "You don't have to come with me," Silas told him. "I can take you to your people and explain what happened." Takakota shook his head. "Takakota go. Must tell father about other children." Other children. The words hit Silas hard. There were more kids in that hidden camp, still waiting to be sold. By bringing Takakota home, they might be able to organize a rescue. The ride north took them through terrain that grew more rugged with each mile. Takakota proved to be an excellent guide despite his young age, pointing out safe paths and water sources that Silas never would have found alone. As they traveled, the boy began to open up. His father, Nalish, was a respected leader who'd been searching for his son since his disappearance. Takakota had been taken while hunting rabbits near the river, grabbed by men who specialized in capturing children from isolated areas. Why children? Silas asked, though he dreaded the answer. Easier to break. Dakota said matter-of-factly. Easier to make forget family. Sell far away. No one come looking. The casual way the boy spoke about it made Silas's stomach turn. This wasn't the first time such a thing had happened. By afternoon, they'd reached the edge of Apache lands. Takakota grew more alert, scanning the horizon for signs of his people. Smoke from cooking fires rose in the distance, and Silas felt his nerves tighten. "They see us," Takakota said simply. Silas looked around but saw nothing. Then movement caught his eye. Figures emerging from behind rocks and trees, appearing as if from nowhere. Apache warriors. At least a dozen of them, surrounding their position with practiced stealth. One of them stepped forward, a tall man with graying hair and scars that spoke of many battles. When he saw Takakota, his stern expression cracked, and Silas heard him whisper a name. "Father," Takakota called out, sliding down from the horse. The reunion was everything Silas had hoped for, a father embracing his lost son with tears streaming down his weathered face. But as Nalish looked up at the white man who brought his boy home, Silas saw something in those eyes that made his blood run cold. Not gratitude, suspicion, and something else that looked dangerously like rage. The other warriors had their weapons ready, and Silas realized he might have made the biggest mistake of his life. Nalish spoke rapidly in Apache to his warriors, his voice carrying the authority of a leader making critical decisions. Silas couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. They were discussing what to do with him. "Father, no," Takakota said in English, stepping between the warriors and Silas. "This man saved Takakota. He good man. White men took you," Nalish replied in careful English, his eyes never leaving Silas. "White man brings you back. Why should I trust any of your people?" The logic was painful but understandable. From Nalish's perspective, white settlers had kidnapped his son and held him for 7 months. Now another white man appeared, claiming to be a rescuer. It could easily be a trick. Silas slowly dismounted, keeping his hands visible and away from his weapons. "I understand your suspicion," he said. "If someone took my boy, I'd feel the same way." "You have no boy," Nalish observed. "No, but I have a mother who would die if I disappeared. Just like you nearly died when Takakota was taken." Something flickered in the Apache leader's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, of the universal pain of a parent's love. Dakota pulled the folded paper from his pocket, the bill of sale that had named him as property. He handed it to his father and began speaking rapidly in Apache, gesturing towards Silas and then toward the south. As Nalish read the document, his expression darkened. He looked at his son's healing wound, then at Silas with new understanding. "My son says you shot him by accident," Nalish said finally. "I did," Silas admitted. "I was hunting. Thought he was a deer. When I realized what I'd done, I couldn't let those men take him back." Those men, the ones who were chasing him. They said he belonged to them, said they'd paid good money for him. Nalish crumpled the paper in his fist, rage building in his features. 23 children, he said. "My son tells me 23 children stolen from their families." "We have to stop them," Silas said. "We." Nalish's voice carried a sharp edge. "You'll need someone who knows their territory. Someone they won't suspect." Silas took a breath. "Someone they think is just another settler." The Apache leader studied him for a long moment. Around them, the warriors waited for his decision, their weapons still ready but no longer pointed directly at Silas. "Why would you risk this?" Nalish asked. "These are not your people's children." Silas thought about Takakota's small hand gripping his shirt, the terror in the boy's eyes, the casual way those men had spoken about selling a child. "Any child is my concern," he said simply. Takakota spoke again in Apache, his young voice earnest and persuasive. Whatever he was saying seemed to carry weight with his father. Finally, Nalish nodded slowly. "My son says you care for his wound like family, fed him from your own table, risked your life to bring him home." He paused. "This is not the action of an enemy." "Then you'll trust me?" "I will use you," Nalish corrected. "There is a difference." But as he spoke, Silas saw something else in the Apache leader's eyes, a glimmer of respect that hadn't been there before. "Tell me about this camp," Nalish said. "Tell me everything my son remembers, and then we will plan how to bring our children home." What neither of them knew was that their conversation was being watched from a distant ridge. The watcher on the ridge was one of Garrett Wells's men, sent to track the escaped merchandise. Through his spyglass, he studied the unlikely meeting between the Apache leader and the young rancher, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Below, Silas was drawing a map in the dirt with a stick, marking locations as Takakota described a hidden camp. The boy's memory was remarkably detailed. He pointed out guard positions, the layout of the prison area, and the times when security was lightest. 23 children, Nalish repeated, his voice heavy with sorrow. Apache Mexican, even some white children taken from isolated homesteads. The buyers come from all over, Takakota added. East, west, north. They take children far away where nobody know them. Silas felt sick thinking about families across the territories, searching for vanished sons and daughters, never knowing their children were being sold like cattle. How many guards? 8 men stay at camp always, Takakota said. More come when buyers arrive. The Apache leader studied the crude map. 8 men against how many warriors? No, Silas said quickly. If Apache warriors attack the camp, they'll kill the children before surrendering. We need a different approach. Nalish's eyes narrowed. What do you suggest, white man? I go in alone first, scout the actual layout, confirm the children are there. Then we coordinate a rescue that saves lives instead of ending them. Too dangerous, Nalish said flatly. I'm the only one who can get close without raising suspicion. Those men know me now. They think I'm just a rancher who got mixed up in their business by accident. It was a reasonable plan, but Nalish clearly didn't like putting his son's rescue in the hands of a settler he barely knew. Dakota spoke up. Father, Silas speaks truth. Guards know white men come to buy children. He can pretend to be buyer. The idea made Silas's skin crawl, but it was brilliant. He could pose as a potential customer, get inside the camp, and report back on the exact situation. And if they discover your deception? Nalish asked. Then I'm dead, and you'll know not to trust any more white men, Silas said grimly. On the distant ridge, the watcher had seen enough. He carefully packed away his spyglass and mounted his horse, riding hard toward the hidden camp with news that would change everything. Back at the meeting site, Nalish was organizing his warriors for the rescue operation. But as they planned, none of them noticed a dust cloud in the distance, dust kicked up by a rider pushing his horse to its limits. We move at dawn, Nalish decided. Silas enters the camp as planned. If he succeeds in scouting, we strike at sunset when the light favors our approach. And if I don't succeed? Silas asked. Then we attack anyway and hope the children survive. It wasn't much of a backup plan, but it was better than leaving 23 kids in the hands of slave traders. As the sun began to set, Silas prepared for what might be his last night alive. He'd gone from accidentally shooting an Apache boy to planning a joint rescue operation with the boy's father, a turn of events he couldn't have imagined that morning. But 20 miles away, Garrett Wells was reading a hastily scrawled message that made him smile coldly. The escaped boy had led them straight to an Apache camp, and now he had leverage he'd never expected. The rescue mission was about to become a trap. At dawn, Silas rode alone toward the hidden camp, a bag of silver coins in his saddlebags and a story rehearsed in his mind. He would pose as a wealthy rancher looking to buy workers for his expanding operation, a common enough practice in the territories, though usually involving adults. The camp sat in a narrow canyon, hidden from casual view but easily defended. As Silas approached the entrance, 2 guards emerged from concealment, rifles ready. State your business, one demanded. Heard you boys might have some young workers for sale, Silas said, trying to keep his voice steady. Name's Ward. I run cattle south of here. The guards exchanged glances. One disappeared into the camp while the other kept watch. Minutes later, a thin man with cold eyes emerged. Garrett Wells himself. Mr. Ward, Wells said with a smile that never reached his eyes. Funny thing. Had some men tell me about you just yesterday. Said you were real interested in our merchandise. Silas's blood chilled. They knew. Somehow they knew exactly who he was and what he'd done. Not sure what you mean, Silas said carefully. Oh, I think you do. Wells signaled to his men, who raised their weapons. See, we've been missing a valuable piece of property. Apache boy about 12 years old. My men tracked him to your ranch. The trap was closing, but Silas forced himself to remain calm. Can't say I know anything about that. Really? Wells pulled out a familiar piece of paper. The bill of sale Dakota had been carrying. Found this in your saddlebags when we searched them. Silas's heart sank. They'd searched his belongings while he was distracted by the guards. But how did they get Takakota's papers? Of course, we also found these. Wells continued, producing the silver coin Silas had brought to make his disguise convincing. Real generous of you to bring payment for the boy's return. Where are the children? Silas asked, abandoning all pretense. Safe and sound, for now. Wells gestured toward the canyon. 22 of them anyway. The one you stole is going to cost you extra. 22. Takakota was safe with his father, but 22 others were still trapped. Children who'd been torn from their families, waiting to be sold to the highest bidder. What do you want? Silas asked. Simple trade. You for them. Wells laughed. See, turns out you're worth more than all those kids combined. I don't understand. Your new Apache friends are real fond of you, from what my scout reports. Willing to risk their lives to help you rescue these children. That kind of loyalty makes you valuable. The horrifying truth hit Silas like a physical blow. Wells planned to use him as bait to draw Nalish and his warriors into a trap. The Apache would come to rescue him, walking straight into an ambush that would devastate their band. They won't come, Silas said desperately. Oh, they will, because that Apache boy of yours is going to tell his daddy exactly where you are. An Apache don't leave debts unpaid. Wells was right. Nalish would honor his agreement and attempt a rescue, not knowing he was leading his people to slaughter. As the guards tied Silas's hands, he caught sight of the children's prison, a makeshift corral surrounded by high wooden walls. Small faces peered through gaps in the planks, eyes wide with fear and hope. But the rescue that was coming would save no one. As sunset approached, Silas sat bound in the center of the camp, positioned exactly where Nalish would see him when the Apache warriors arrived. Wells had positioned 15 men around the canyon, more than double what Takakota had reported. They'd called in reinforcements, turning the rescue into a massacre. But Wells had made one crucial mistake. He assumed Apache warriors would charge in recklessly to save their white ally. The first sign that his assumption was wrong came as shadows began lengthening across the canyon floor. Instead of war cries and thundering hooves, there was only silence. Where are they? One guard whispered nervously. Wells checked his pocket watch. They'll come. Apache honor demands it. But Nalish had spent 30 years surviving frontier conflicts. He didn't charge into obvious traps. The attack, when it came, was nothing like Wells expected. It began with the guards on the canyon rim simply disappearing. No shots fired, no sound of struggle. One moment they were there, the next they were gone. Morrison, Stevens. Wells called toward the ridge. No answer. That's when Silas understood. While Wells had been focused on the main entrance, Apache warriors had scaled the canyon walls under cover darkness, systematically eliminating the outer guards. A rope dropped from above, landing precisely where Silas sat. In one fluid motion, he was pulled upward and out of the camp before Wells could react. Find them. Wells screamed, but his remaining men were already under attack. Apache warriors seemed to materialize from every shadow, their assault coordinated and devastating. But they weren't trying to kill everyone. They were driving the guards away from the children's corral. Silas, cut free by Takakota, who'd insisted on joining the rescue, ran toward the makeshift prison. The children inside were pressed against the walls in terror, too frightened to understand they were being rescued. It's all right, Silas called in English in the few Apache words Dakota had taught him. You're going home. The corral gate was secured with heavy chains. As Silas struggled with the locks, he heard footsteps behind him. Wells, bleeding from a head wound, had a pistol trained on him. You cost me everything, Wells snarled. But before he could fire, a small stone struck his gun hand. Takakota stood 20 feet away, already loading another stone into his sling, a skill that had helped him survive 7 months of captivity. The pistol went flying, and Nalish appeared from the shadows to end Wells's threat permanently. "The children!" Silas gasped, finally breaking the chains. What followed was controlled chaos. 22 children ranging in age from 8 to 15 stumbled out of their prison. Apache children ran to waiting warriors. But there were also Mexican and white children who had no one. What happens to them? Silas asked, gesturing to the non-Apache children. "They come with us," Nalish said simply, "until their families can be found." As dawn broke over the canyon, the rescue was complete. Every child was accounted for. The guard were either dead or scattered, and the camp was destroyed. But the real shock came when they returned to Apache territory. Word of the joint rescue had spread, and something unprecedented was happening. White settlers from 3 different ranches had ridden to the edge of Apache lands, not with weapons, but with offers of help. Families who'd lost children to slavers, traders who'd heard rumors of missing kids, all of them wanting to assist in reuniting the rescued children with their families. "This is not the end," Nalish told Silas as they watched Apache and settler families working together. "This is how it begins." Silas looked at Takakota, who was teaching an Apache boy to speak English while learning Spanish from a rescued Mexican girl. The young rancher had accidentally shot an Apache boy, but what he did next had shocked everyone, including himself. He'd proven that sometimes the most unlikely alliances create the most powerful change.